to exchange ideas on design and build practices, temporary public space, tactical urbanism, political architectural issue, and many more subjects.
Ideas.
Sorry. Can you turn off the microphone, please? Okay. So before this, the beginning of this, sorry, I hear my voice. I don't know why. Okay, well. So before being a series of digital events, VUOTO was conceived as a magazine or as a series of different publications, which I loved since the day one. And I have somewhere here, let me show to everyone. This is the issue number 1, and that was published just the day after the first lockdown in Italy. So it was published the May 4th, 2020. And to me, this project, the first issue of this project represented the sense of loss, of emptiness, from which derives the word vuoto, that means empty, felt by the collective. Because as you may know, the Orizzontale is a practice-based research collective. So they need to act on public spaces. So the first 2 months of lockdown were pretty tough for them, for everyone, but for them in particular, to me. And so the first issue is about the collection of reflection, the feelings, and the conversation they had during the first lockdown. And then they published also the second issue, in which they keep on reflecting and investigating the new forms of practicing and designing the public space. So this series of digital events, if I'm not wrong, it will also be part of a third issue of VUOTO. But if you want to know more about the whole initiative of VUOTO, you can go to the website, vuoto.xyz. It is important to say that we are here thanks to the collaboration with Federico De Matteis from Università degli Studi dell'Aquila and Elena Pelosi from MAXXI Aquila, who have produced and supervised scientifically this initiative. And of course, thanks to Giuseppe Grant from Orizzontale, who coordinated this, the whole program of VUOTO Talks. So before presenting the guests and the discussant of this VUOTO Talk, I give the floor to Mr. Federico De Matteis for the institutional welcome.
So thank you, Salvatore. Hello, everyone. I will be very, very fast because I already did my, let's say, general institutional academic introduction 2 weeks ago when we spoke with Nicola Hennier. So this will be just to welcome everyone and say that we are still very happy at the Department of Engineering and Architecture at the University of L'Aquila of hosting this series of talks. And in particular, today we welcome Andreas Lang, and we look forward to hearing about his work. And the first event was extremely interesting, in my opinion. We had some amazing projects and some very good discussion afterwards. So I hope that it will be the same exciting encounter also today. So thank you, and good afternoon to everyone.
Okay, now it's time to introduce today's guest, Andreas Lang from London. Andreas is the co-founder of Public Works, a non-for-profit critical organization, the critical design practice that occupies the terrain between art, architecture, and research. Working with an extended network of interdisciplinary collaborators, Public Works aims to rework spatial, social and economic opportunity towards citizen-driven development and improved civic life. The practice, set up in 2004, uses a range of approaches, including public events, campaigns, the development of urban strategies, and participatory art and architecture projects across all scales. Andreas is also the leader of the Master in Architecture at the Centre St. Martin's in London, and he has taught architecture at numerous institutions since 2001, including the Architectural Association, Sheffield University, the Royal College of Art, and Umeå School of Architecture in Sweden. After his presentation, that will be more or less 30 minutes, he will conversate with our discussant from Milan, Azzurra Muzzonigro. She is an architect, curator, and independent urban researcher. She is the co-founder of Waiting Post-Human Studios, a multidisciplinary research platform across art, architecture, urban planning, and philosophy. And since January 2018, she started working as an independent curator and a research consultant for the Design Museum of Milan, Triennale Milano, for the organization of festivals and exhibitions. She also is currently curating with Florencia Andreola and for the Urban Center of the Municipality of Milan, a public program and research project called Sex and the City, which blend gender perspective and on urban space. So, two small notes. If you want to send a question through our, you can send your question through our social media channels, so YouTube and Facebook. And for the student of the University of L'Aquila, if you are interested in formative credits, write your name in the chat. So I give the floor finally to Andreas for your presentation. Thank you to everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be in Italy for a moment with you in L'Aquila. So yeah, thank you very much, and really pleased to be here, and also in that really nice series. And I haven't seen the publication, so hopefully I can steal one at one point. So yeah, I'm going to show only one project, and I'm going to share my screen now. And can you see that? Yeah, is that visible? Someone has to give me a sign.
Yes, it is.
Thank you. So, super, 1 second, I can't see my cursor. All right, so we are a group called Public Works. We've been going since 1999 for quite a while. And the word public works for us needs to be understood in the context. We were artists and architects coming together to do socially engaged projects. At the time, Nicolas Bourriot published his book, Relational Aesthetics, which talked also about the movement in the art world that left the gallery and focused on social relations as a form. Within context, it's also the time where Margaret Thatcher just has left, and Margaret Thatcher famously said, there is no such thing as society, there's only the individual, men, women, and families. And for us, that was quite a strong time. That kind of, there was a lack of the belief in the public. And we felt public works also for us was that motto of that the public does work. There is value within the public, and there's value in the collective as well. So that's the context within Public Works was born. And I would say we always occupied a position which is slightly on the margin between art and architecture, between disciplines. And I think that position of being on the edges always comes into focus when there is a crisis. I noticed 2008, when there was a financial crisis, but also now in COVID. And Boris Johnson here you have him, our wonderful prime minister, when he had COVID himself, suddenly remembered there is such thing as society. So in moments of crisis, the collective and the the shared becomes mobilized and becomes remembered and is really important. And we noticed that very much within our practice. So throughout, we felt that this value of the collective needs to be produced and reproduced. And I think temporary use offers an opportunity for this. So I thought I'd start off my presentation by just giving a bit of context. One, I think it's important to talk about London, because I think it's possibly quite different to L'Aquila and Italy. I thought it's interesting to remind us about a little bit of the history of temporary use and where we are now with it in London, and also this idea of imaginaries. So London, what you see here in the middle is a render of a building in Hackney Wick, which is the new normal. This is how London is pushing ahead. It's highly privatized, it's very expensive, and the flats are extremely small. At the same time, the state is receding and the welfare state is receding. So this idea that the state look after you is increasingly less relied upon. And this idea of community resilience is actively promoted by my local government, meaning we should build networks that help us be resilient in crisis and be connected. The issue is with these new environments that spaces where these resilient communities can grow are often absent. And the top left is an example of a woman who lives in one of those flats who doesn't have enough space indoors or in her building to repair her bicycle, so she is occupying the pavement. So there's, on the one hand, this very aggressive capital-driven drive to develop, very dense and very market-driven, but at the same time, with the withdrawal of the state, there's a real need of finding spaces where resilient practices can emerge from. At the same time, it's really important to understand that the withdrawal of the state also happens within the planning department. So you can see the numbers here of the withdrawal in 2010. There's an active kind of hollowing out of all these municipal departments. So really the market in many cases is taking over and filling these gaps. And I think another point that's really important to mention, that's where the comments come in. These are all forms of enclosure, this withdrawal of the state on the one hand, but the heavy privatization on the other. And the biggest privatization in the UK, which is often not so talked about, is that of land. The cities and the state actively selling all public land off. And I think there's only 2% of London that remains as being publicly owned. So for us, the work from Public Works is also to actively counter this idea of enclosures, of this increasing privatization, not only of our culture, but also of land specifically. So this is the context in which we operate. It's a very rushed introduction to London, and probably one that is not so celebrated externally. Often when I go abroad, say in Sweden, people told me, oh, we are 15 years behind you. And I think what they mean is that the neoliberal state is, the neoliberal project of privatization is more advanced here. Temporary use, and I put these three words up, temporary use, interim use, and meanwhile use, and I'm going to explain their meaning to me. Temporary use, and I think it's quite nice. We talked about it yesterday, that the motto of L'Aquila means stay still. So there's a nice kind of contradiction between staying still and being temporary. For me, the discourse about temporary use really began with this publication, with the research project in Berlin, led by Philip Oswald, or the Urban Pioneers, which started to map the kind of interstitial, the empty spaces in Berlin, which were then occupied by community groups on a temporary basis. This kind of appropriation of the city through the citizen and often through the amateur. So it's not the architects or the developers or the artists moving in, but residents of all walks of life. This then got really, I think that book really, and it's worth reading, it really kind of established the discourse around temporary use. I think once the architecture, the art world got hold of it, I think it's often described as interim. And this is the constitution of the interim by Stealth, which really argues for the protection of that temporary interim space. So you protect the values that are in there. So you offset the values, I think, of experimentation, this openness, this kind of open-endedness, which is counter to the kind of norm of the city. So the interim for me is often described as a kind of optimistic view that can we use that space to reproduce the city, maybe with a different logic and with a different imaginary. Tempelhof is for me a good example of where this happened on a really big scale. I'm not going to go into it so much. This is a book published by Peter Bishop, who's a town planner in the UK. And this is for me where the term meanwhile starts to appear. So meanwhile for me is where the city and the city governance and developer start to actively and strategically think about how we can use meanwhile in the development of the city. So it moves from a kind of space of appropriation and thinking the city differently to a tool for city development. And I think that's often where temporary becomes a meanwhile in our debate. And this is a document, that's a diagram from that document, which promotes this idea that temporary is nearly the seed for the permanent use, which in theory is very nice, I think, that the kind of temporary has a kind of subversive quality to set the tone for the permanent development. In reality, I have seen very little of this happening in the bigger scale. It comes more from this grassroots movement where I feel that is taking place. And with it comes a kind of mechanization of the temporary. This is a document produced by the Olympics, who had a lot of empty space, and it becomes nearly like a template of how to run temporary use spaces. Each one is one example broken down in mobilization, activation, and then legacy on site. So I think it's important that there is a certain nuance in how temporary use is used by different actors, and that's also reflected in the wording. For us, I'm not going to go into it. For us, temporary use, this is a book we published on Hackney Wick in 2015, together with geographer Mara Ferreri, who's also an Italian. And it really looked at the idea that development is not linear and how temporary actions and temporary use can steer this development. So it's how can you use temporary use to really interrupt and steer, maybe, or nudge the city development. Is this okay so far? Yeah, give me some feedback here. So the last of the 3 points is utopian impulses. And this is a quote by Lefebvre via David Pinder, which says, in order to extend the possible, it is necessary to desire the impossible. So it's really the idea of how can we think the city differently, and how can we imagine another reality, and how can we work from what we have now, where we understand what is possible, to really kind of extend our own imagination and therefore our actions. And he spoke about this idea of an utopian impulse, which is where maybe on a small scale, you already act out different values, either through events or through kind of shorter term projects. And for me, this is very much directly applicable to how we understand temporary use, that you enact in a way a mini utopias on site, alternative sets of values on site. This is a project we've done in a music festival in Denmark and Sweden, and we walked around and tried to, within the music festival, try to map these utopian impulses. And often in festivals, you find that realities get flipped around. So maybe you want to be really dirty, or you want to piss everywhere, or you want to stop being good. Or I think there's something about this this enactment of another set of values. Even there might be kind of counter to what you see, but there might also be stepping stones to a kind of alternative cities. So it's really this kind of contrast of where the utopian impulse meets the very neoliberal city development, which is very strong in where we are in East London. So I hope that made sense. I hope that kind of frames a little bit our context and our idea around our belief, I guess, in temporary use, and that we see it really as an active tool to negotiate city making, and not in a way as a kind of form of entertainment, which is sometimes the case. I don't know how I'm doing with time. Let me check. I want to introduce one project, and if there's time, I want to touch upon teaching as well. When we spoke yesterday, the idea of education was important. But let me start with a project that we've been doing for several years, and it's, even though it's temporary, it's very slow. The work has not been commissioned as such. We work often. We work on commissions, but very rarely, and often we fundraise for the projects ourselves. And therefore, they sometimes are very slow and rely on a lot of different stakeholders to come on board. This project started out as a collaboration with, let me go through. This started out with a collaboration with a French architecture office called AAA, Studio for Self-Managed Architecture. And we built 3 prototypes, 2 in France, in Cologne, and 1 in Hackney Wick, which is in East London. Sorry, Hackney Wick is where the Olympics arrived in 2012. You can see the orange strip, which before the Olympics arrived was really a forgotten piece of industrial land. And it moved from these warehouses where a lot of artists and I guess creative class has settled down and have produced this kind of ways of living and working in the city, which was very different. Sorry, you can only see it from the outside. And it's being replaced very quickly by this. So for us, we thought what would be really important is to understand the existing practices that make a kind of city which looks different, and how can we work with that knowledge and help it transition into the more permanent. So it goes back to that diagram of Peter Bishop. So we got an electric vehicle, which became our venue. And with this vehicle, for 2 years, we drove around Hackney Wick and engaged with quite a lot of different spaces, people, stakeholders, really looking for those actors who are actively producing the city which is resilient, which is based on mutual aid, which is based on recycling and reuse, and maybe now we would call it planetary care. So the milk float, or the vehicle, became a way of transporting, it became a production space, it became an exhibition space, and it became our space which we could visit other people. The idea was that we built a network of relationships and allyship through this process, and then together occupy a piece of land. And that's really where temporary use became, so maybe before it was mobile use, and then it became temporary use, where it's located itself physically in one side. And the idea of that building was that it's in itself mobile and iterative. So as we might arrive with 2-3 containers, we might be given another site a bit later, and it grows and shrinks and splits a bit like a cell. What was also important about this architecture is really the relations. And we tried really hard to build networks of custodianship that can govern and share that building. So you really create an ecosystem of participants that have an active stake, but also take on custodianship, that building. So for us, the architecture even doesn't look spectacular. I think it comes alive through the relationships it sets up, both to land, that it occupies lots of land that's available for free, and in the way it ties a network together. So you can see some of the examples of the 2 years going around. There were maybe 4 ways of engaging, and I talk about them through. One is through active making, that we would take part. Top left, we joined the making of a skate park out of reused material and making that process public and becomes a learning opportunity. Top right, we hosted a lot of what we call WIC sessions, where we brought actors together to actively discuss and create a platform, which gives a forum for critical reflection. Bottom right is, which I think was very important in the Olympic context, that you have a very strong narrative coming in and dominating everything of Olympics are great. And this really collected multiple other voices and narratives, those that were displaced, those were there for a long time and have taken their roots there, etc. And the bottom right is really those people who have built practices in this landscape, which are quite interesting. We call them local experts. For example, Charlie, he occupied land and grew this plant and really developed a practice of commoning in that landscape, where he occupied 40 hectares of land without anyone noticing for 40 years. And started to build incredible knowledge about the landscape. So it was about understanding these practices in detail and also then starting to document them. So here you see his the way he uses this plant to create a fertilizer. So a lot of that work that we were interested in has a strong quality of DIY, of the self-made. We called it household knowledge, that of where the production is very direct, of the local people producing, but also with means that are available locally. And I think that's throughout our work, the idea of the DIY is really quite crucial. I showed you a lot of remaking, really making the idea of production and making of the city very public and bringing this into the street. And also remembering maybe forgotten techniques that are quite useful and really remembering them. This is a technique, a Japanese technique. Instead of paint systems, we used burning to create this kind of deep wood char. Sorry, I don't have a picture that stops insects, but you also don't need toxic paint systems. And also it's actually fire retardant, so it stops it from burning. So the reenactment and the remembering of maybe techniques that are easily accessible, but also speak of a kind of environmental concern have been really important to reproduce and showcase. Counter narratives I talked about already. This was really quite often happened for us, just displaying on the one hand these relationships and stories we found, but also occupying spaces, even if it's temporary. This is when the Olympic Park was opened up again. So really bringing the displaced voice back into Hackneywick. And maybe the last thing I think it is, the idea of prototyping has become quite important to us. So testing ideas on a small scale very quickly, and then reproduce them and build the capacity and the networks around them to reproduce them on a bigger scale. So one example would be that we looked at how could we produce our own energy locally for a neighborhood. In this case, we looked at an anaerobic digester, which is simulating the processes within a cow. So you take organic waste and it produces biogas and fertilizer. And it's a kind of concept that's very kind of common in the developing world, but also on a very large scale in the agricultural world, but not very common in a local context in the Western countries. So we started to build one as a pilot. here it is. It produces, on one day, it produces around 8 hours of gas, 15 liters of fertilizer. And here we try to stage in a way how it works with everyone that's been involved. It started to create a quite extensive network of a community that's specifically interested in this idea of sustainable energy locally. And I think that's often quite important to mention, that the community you're serving is not only local, it's also communities of interest that have taken interest in the theme that might sit across London. What has been really interesting in this project is that it started on a very DIY, small scale. You can build a digester at the scale of a Coke bottle, and we scaled it up to a scale of a container. And this allowed us to really build a network of expertise around it, of scientists, of like-minded community organizations, of energy cooperatives, of universities. And it's now being reproduced on a much larger scale in another project of ours, where it really tries to power the entire project with energy, but also collect the food waste from a local housing estate. So it's demonstrating this idea of a circular economy on a small scale, like here. This was one of our test events. You can see the gas we produced. We're trying to cook, and it really demonstrates the idea of that circular movement, that the waste produces gas and fertilizer. You grow more food. The food is being eaten and cooked by the gas, and it's kind of an ongoing circle. Another example would be air quality. London has very big air pollution. We started to look at how you can use planting to filter air, and we found moss. So we started to look into how we can use grow moss and use these moss walls to filter air locally. Left is the very first prototype built, and on the right you can see the moss wall being built. So it's collecting the water at the top, it's dripping down. The moss at the moment is missing. But this is the idea of, again, trying DIY solutions and nature-based solutions to remedy some of the issues of the city, and something you can do locally. I think maybe I stop there. There's, of course, these spaces, they're really important in terms of what I said earlier, that you produce an alternative way of living in the city, which is not perfect. And it's deliberately maybe not perfect. It's open and accessible, so there can be an exchange of these practices and a reproduction of these practices. So this idea of teaching and disseminating is really crucial, but also the idea of governance, how we set up governance structure that govern those spaces, so it's mutual. And maybe in this context, you can see here in the background, there's a housing estate. It's just been decided that these 4,000 homes will be knocked down and replaced. So what I said earlier, is that this development is coming also to this corner. And this is where the project gets another kind of agency, as going into conversations with the city and with the developers to understand how some of these values and some of the learning can be anchored into the development. And that's just happening. So it's really bridging, in a way, the top down and the bottom up in some form. So I don't know if I have more time. I could quickly speak about education, but we could stop it here. Maybe give me some feedback.
No, you can talk about the project relate to education, and then we can discuss it together.
Yeah, is it understandable so far? Okay, good.
Yes, it is.
I'm just talking to my screen, you know, it makes sense to me, but I'm not sure if it makes sense. So that's me wearing the mask of Colin Ward, and he is one of our heroes. I don't know if he's very well known outside the UK. He was an anarchist and town planner, and he wrote a lot about children in the city and about development of the city and how development can become more participatory. And he was part of the deschooling movement around Ivan Illich, Paulo Freire. There is a kind of strong tradition in which he sits. And I think he had two ideas which resonate a lot with us. One is this idea of an exploded classroom, that the city should be our classroom, not the classroom should be our classroom, and that we learn through projects in the city. And he's been addressing, I think, youth primarily, but I think we can apply this in our case also to other age groups very much, university students, but also I would say or elderly. I mean, anyone who's still learning, like we all should. And the other idea is that of the urban rooms. He established a series of urban rooms which helped to democratize planning, which really built on this idea of the exploded classroom, which set in neighborhoods. They built capacity locally, so residents could understand how the planning and development process work, and they could articulate in a way positions and ideas towards this. So it's really about building capacity locally and giving access to what has become quite complex processes. So here's Colin Ward. I really recommend you. I don't know if it's translated. Street Work is a really wonderful book. There are a number of books that are really wonderful. So here the urban rooms, it's a catalyst for meaningful urban change. An alternative to the institution of the school, a connector between planners, architects, and the public as a space for planning and spatial planning and consultation, a venue for community forums, and archive of urban resources. And I think that these urban rooms have, with Thatcher as well, have become, the funding has been withdrawn and they've been heavily undermined. But I think they're still very important. If you go and work in these communities, often development is a very abstracted process that you need to be an expert in to take part. At least that's the feeling. Another idea in terms of pedagogy that's really important for us is that of embodied criticality, of that of a situated knowledge, that the shift of being the critical observer from the outside or being in the situation, acting and being within it with your body is a very different one. And that's, I think, what Irid Rogoff calls embodied criticality. So that you're not the outsider critiquing, but building really in active positions by embodying the situation, by occupying it. And I think that's, for us, is really important as a position. So we started the School for Civic Action, which is really sitting in the tradition of Colin Ward, which we noticed in a lot of our projects, and Urban is just one. There's a lot of knowledge production. There's a lot of knowledge exchange. How can we understand this as a network of schools? That the learning that takes place within our project, how can we see that as a school, not as a school that is open from Monday to Friday, but that appears and disappears and exists over time. We have a manifesto, and maybe I quickly talk about a few of those manifesto points. I explained this already. The city is our classroom, so we actively embed ourselves in neighborhood and engage with citizens. So these are a few of the classrooms we've been producing. This is again in Roskilde Festival. Sorry, I go a bit quicker because I know it's late. The idea of performance. So we perform change through public events, producing alternative futures. And that's performance, I would say, on a scale of an evening, but also on the scale of a temporary use project. This I already mentioned, the idea of prototyping. In response to the culture and history of a city, we prototype new ways of working, making, and organizing, so that you really understand this work of sowing the seed, that there's something prototypical and model making in your actions. The idea that social relations will ultimately empower change. So to affect change, we produce new social relations and support existing ones to grow. And this is really relating to a text by Rancière, that students become teachers and teachers become students. This idea of the kind of power hierarchy within learning, that you can already through teaching yourself, if you have a minimal knowledge and you start teaching, you already become a learner while you're a teacher. So it's playing with these roles is quite important in the school. And I think really exploring an ecosystem of learning, which is goes from the dialogic, so through dialogue, the incidental learning that happens a lot in these projects, where you pick up, as you do things, you pick up knowledge quite accidentally or incidentally, the more formal learning through observation, and then the instructional learning. So we actively try to build a number of ecosystems of learning. And the last one, and I think is a quite important one, is that of accreditation, that we use, at the moment we were looking into blockchain to find ways to accredit knowledge so it can be used also in other contexts. So often we find that we have a lot of local residents that have an amazing expertise, but maybe can't showcase that expertise. And what this blockchain technology allows you, this badges, is to some way accredit this into, so it's recognized and can be then recognized, say, by higher education or by future employers. So that's, in a very rushed way, the School for Civic Action, which really sits across a lot of our projects. And that's me, my daughter dressed up as Jane Jacobs. Thank you very much. And I stop sharing. Oh, I don't know how to stop sharing because I can't see my cursor. Ah, there you go.
Thank you, Andreas, for your presentation. I really loved the different definition you have for different kind of projects. No, we usually define everything temporary project or bottom-up project, but then temporary, the meanwhile, the interim, and also it fits very well with the another definition that Orizzontale gives to their project, that is the incremental design of public spaces. I also loved the slowness and grime as strategies against the commodification of public space. Mm-hmm. I will use them these concepts again. And maybe it's banal, but I want to also to highlight the different perspectives that are included in your work. So it's not just about art and architecture, but it's also about performance, so action in public space. Is about pedagogy, so learning together about your neighborhood also, because you had your local expert studying the different plants growing informally over there. And I think that this capability of intersecting and overlapping issues, also social identities and way of thinking, is something that also defines the work of Azzurra. It is the discussant. So I would like to ask Azzurra to interact with your presentation and maybe to highlight some more issues on on public spaces and the issue related to public space, also through your work and your experiences.
Yes, sure. Thank you so much, Salvatore, and thank you, Andreas, for this amazing presentation. I have to say I knew a little bit the work by Public Works, of course, but I really enjoyed this in-depth, let's say, exploration, as it gave me a lot of nuances. So on many of the things you said, I feel extremely in line, especially I would like to say, let's say, on the educational field. So we were having a conversation yesterday, in which I was telling you a little bit where I'm coming from, and I'm coming from this, I would call it the school of Stalker. Therefore, the practice of Stalker is based on walking in the margins, and therefore the presence of the body is absolutely crucial, because the body is what allows you to encounter differences, different identities, and therefore, to start the energy that then leads to, perhaps projects, to start projects, because projects are made of encounters. So, and it's also an aspect that is, try to somehow approach teaching less as a mental, discipline, and more as an embodied practice. Exactly. So, and not only that, it's also the fact of that education is an active part of society. So you're not just giving information in a passive way or transferring information, but what you're doing is an active segment of the creation of society. Therefore, the class, is part of the construction of a process of identity somehow, which is always in transformation. So, and also, for example, Salvatore was present in some of my classes a few years ago, in which, we were having exams, for example, in this space of Macau. I remember at that moment. So the exam was actually the voice of the student in a moment of public engagement. So it was not, showing panels on the wall in a classroom, but it was them raising their points in a three-dimensional way in a space in form of an installation that meant somehow, a piece of a process. So in that, I think we are completely, on the same page, I would like to say. So, but, there are many things that you've touched upon. And of course, maybe the first point I would like to raise is just to go straight in the critical issues, is looking at planning as a wide process, right? So in which there are and a complex process as well, which is, the ability of putting together different voices and different interests. So, so the point is, through this civic engagement projects and processes, of course, the point is to make visible what one particular segment of society wants. Then, to me, at least in this moment of life, I would like to say, what is crucial is how do you intersect public administration at a certain point? So what capacity do these practices have to engage with the public administration and, be influential in how or change somehow the process, and therefore suggest other developments that are less aggressive if you're speaking economically. Okay. And to our experience, I would like to say, maybe from the Milan perspective, Orizzontale is also involved in this, what I'm about to say. In my opinion, there is a good hint that is the use of tactical urbanism, for example. So it's something that follows a bit the line of what you were saying, of saying, let's start to do prototypes. So let's start to do interventions that are in small scale, low budget, but that allow us to use the space quickly, you know, and show what potential use there can be in a modified use of space. Okay, so, and therefore there was that beautiful drawing or graphic that you showed, you know, how temporary use then lead or may lead to permanent changes. And that's a point that I would like to discuss with you about, you know, this intersection between temporanity and longer term, which of course has to do with, you know, planning and what impact do these temporary practices have on the longer term planning, processes. I don't know if this was clear. Maybe I was, too many things.
It kind of happens in very unexpected and different ways. This kind of how this impact is produced, the larger impact onto the bigger picture or be planning. And in some instances, and I think most what drives it is that you establish a culture which then gets reproduced and gets visible, understood, and reproduced. And that reproduction happens in the most unexpected ways. So for example, the digester, for example, it's been really nice that it's now, because we understood it, it could be imagined into another bigger scheme. And we can use this as a precedence, as a kind of say, look, it happened here on a small scale, it works, it's really interesting, I can take you there, see it, understand it, let's do it. And I think this world of the precedence is very important in Britain, where the legal framework is very different to the Napoleonic one. The legal framework here is built on precedence. So if you can quote that someone has done it before somewhere in law, then you can refer to it and it can be a justification of why you should do it again. So that's within the culture, it's quite important, this idea of precedence, that you create precedence even on a small scale to refer to going forward. Also, I noticed over time, and I think that's what I said, you know, the margins, in times of crisis, the margins are looked at and drawn to in terms of knowledge they produce. And I've seen that in 2008, where suddenly a lot of money was left out of the public purse. So how do you produce still public spaces with different means? That was one moment where this kind of practices were turned to, and where planning bodies started to talk to us. The Olympics started to talk to us. And also now with the environmental crisis, it's quite a lot. I think if you have some knowledge of how you can combine this idea of local empowerment with climate action, there is a conversation suddenly with the mayor's office, with the local developer, etc. So these are conversations that you then have to enter into, and that's for me, that's where the embodied criticality comes into. You suddenly go into conversation with sometimes people you don't share the same value system with. But I think that's where the city is being contested. So I do feel that's where the prototypes and that understanding you build up through the prototypes becomes important, that you can go into these conversations and argue for it. And the fact that maybe the last one is, I call it the foot in the door tactic, which I've seen very, you get given a short lease with a little bit of time. And you put your foot in and you produce as much of a reality as you can, and then negotiate from there. And I think that's what happened to us very much. I think we get the car park for 2 years. We put our containers. It's quite heavy. It's a bit of a risk. you get a presence, you negotiate an extension to the lease, and you suddenly create a value that becomes recognizable. And from that position, you go into conversation with the planning body. I hope that's an answer to your question, but I feel it happens on multiple levels in a way, and it's not always adversarial. It's not always conflicted. In some cases, we found actually the agendas align, but they don't. The mechanism with which the city produces the city is sometimes quite difficult, and we can be much more agile in creating certain ideas, producing certain ideas.
Yeah, can I just build on what Andreas just said, Salvatore?
Yes, of course.
Thanks. Okay, no, because you touch upon a theme that is very, let's say, close to me. So I would really like to speak with you more about this, which is, the value and the role and the possibility of the margin. Okay, so it is a field of investigation, that is that I've been looking at and working in a lot, coming from, let's say, the third landscape by Gilles Clément, and of course all what is, wilderness and all what is informal and all of that, what I'm saying, no? So the specific conversation that I would like to have with you is, there is a very thin line in the possibility of the margin, on one hand, to become the expression of a new and different spatial and economic organization, okay? And on the other hand, the risk of, being appropriated by the same old neoliberal logic. You know what I'm saying? I mean, yeah. Of course, I'm talking all the possible washing. You choose the color. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's a danger, but I think it would be foolish to isolate yourself and just not be in dialogue. I think the idea that the project is slow is part of a resistance of that as well, that you allow yourself to be delayed and slow. And so I think my feeling is we're constantly trying to carve out these moments where it can happen on our terms as much as on their terms. And I think that's the kind of pressure of time is quite an important one, especially when you talk about temporary use. You have 3 years to do a project, and there's this mobilization that goes in and the energy. And that's why I quite like the idea of the iterative, because it's using the logic of the temporary, but it's also acknowledging the length of it in a way. It doesn't lock itself into this kind of temporary logic of we have to mobilize everything now to produce it, but it can have its own rhythm in the long term. I don't know if it quite answers your question about the margins.
Yeah, let me
think they're connected.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to quote my master, Francesco Carreri, in this specific point when he often says, by losing time, we gain space. Meaning that by, subtracting ourselves and our bodies from the productive logic, we gain, of course, physical and political space.
Which I think is very true. And I think it's something I notice a lot in commissions. I know, Giuseppe, we are in a commission together in Austria, and there's immediately this pressure of you have to have a time frame in which you deliver. And I think to build by yourself thinking time, I find myself often delaying, and especially this, to create that idea of time in which you can think and maybe produce from another value system or another position. And I think that's the same in the city, that you build these time bubbles for yourself.
Yeah. I don't know if you have issues, Salvatore. Or
no, I wanted to comment also the issue of time that is also escaped from the quantification. I don't know, or how can you define the quality of participation? Not with time, for sure. So that's important to be slow and to be grime, as I said before. And then I wanted you to ask, well, yesterday I was looking of the groups that participated to the School for Civic Action, and that reminded me a map that I saw last Sunday at the Piccolo Theater. It is called La Mappa della Cura, and in which, in a way, Azzurra is part, no? Because Azzurra, for a project in particular, participated, involved this ebony carpenter workshop for the designing and the construction of a hut. So, and here comes the issue of visibility. So it is important with this kind of projects to give the voice and to give also space, because we are an architect, to marginalized group of people that for Milan, for this map of the care, let's say, are an archipelago of practices and groups that are not visible for the municipality, but that, especially in this period of crisis, give a huge effort for the for poor people. For example, delivering food to for the disemployed people, etc. But this map, making it visible in a public assembly, it was fundamental to me. So I wanted you to talk about the groups that are participating in the school or in your projects.
I don't know the map. It would be really wonderful to see. So, and we are very bad at mapping all this, so I apologize. I guess it's in the school. It depends on the context in which we produce it, but it's and it depends how much time we have to situate ourselves. In Urban, there are multiple groups. There are local Bangladeshi community, which is very hard to reach and bring into that conversation of planning. So we've translated a lot of our work into Bangladeshi, especially that part of the project which are of interest, the gardening and the food production. We have, there are community groups from across London that deal with local energy production. There is a lot of recycling and reuse and repair cultures groups. So, and then there's schools. We work a lot with schools, and through this children work with parents, and this is super diverse in that area specifically. And we work with students from universities like architecture and art. And it's quite a mix in that sense of that. In the School for Civic Action, again, the last project we did worked with those affected by development that are being displaced quite directly. And that picture of the street was really to, the idea behind it was to build an evidence base of those that are being displaced in terms of a community charter. So the groups we engaged with were all the local community centers, the elderly that have lived there forever, but where their kids can't no longer live there. So it's, I'm not sure if they're necessarily groups that are defined, they might be defined by that they share similar concerns or they're threatened by the similar change, but they're not necessarily, it's only the Bangladeshis. They're not necessarily defined by ethnicity or class or wealth, but maybe they're brought together through specific circumstances or interests, if that makes sense. Did that answer it a little bit? Yeah, Salvatore?
Also, it is interesting to see how the interests overlap. So you are like the director, because I don't think in general agreement on everything, no? So you have to direct these different.
But it's also sometimes there's a conflict, because sometimes this local resident might see us as part of the city, you know, because we are in conversation with them, and sometimes we become nearly in the middle, and other times it's the other way around. So that the relationships need to develop quite slowly, and the trust in these relationships needs to develop slowly, so people understand who you are and what your interest is in that dynamic.
Yeah, can I step into that?
Yeah.
No, just wanted to, you know, highlight a little bit, go deeper into this idea of mapping. Because I think, you know, mapping is somehow, in my experience, at least, a very important tool of building a political identity, if you want. So that's the moment in which you show who is who and what they're doing, because it is a very powerful tool also of visual recognition. Because that's, at least in my experience, let's say, is the space in which you go to the different community and show that, you know, what potential alliances there might be in space. Because maybe, you know, they just don't know that there is the other community that is sharing the same interests, so they're, you know, that, yes, they are different, but they can share values. So, and that's where you see it in space, and where you see the potentiality of, you know, building those relationships. So that's one thing that I wanted to highlight. And the other thing is, you know, a little bit building on what Salvatore was saying about the economy of solidarity that, you know, is showing up. I think we are now living in a moment of, you know, of an incredible historical moment where there has been a drastic cut on how on the business as usual, if you want, no. So, and that's in my opinion a moment in which very important moment in which these different economies or different solidarity networks or care city, or call it as you want, you know, may arise and may really give the possibility of applying a different model of the city, a city that maybe, you know, is less. We are experimenting. I think all of our cities are now, you know, have drastically reduced, if not up to zero, the level of tourism, for example. So imagining, we are experiencing a city that is less, you know, less subjected to the fast, experience. And maybe one model that is being carried out in Paris and also Milan is trying to do is this, is called the 15 minutes city. Is, you know, the idea of working basically on neighborhoods and having neighborhoods as, you know, empowering neighbors and making them as almost, I don't want to say self-sufficient, because then all cities interconnected, of course, but that you can find within your neighborhood all the services and all the anything that may help you in the ordinary life, you know. So, but with this, I want to say a model of city that is that wants to address more of its citizens than, you know, the tourists in the end. Yeah, I don't know. It's just suggestions.
Yeah, it's about providing services for the citizenship.
Yeah, it's the city of proximity.
Rather than beautify the neighborhoods for tourists, no.
Rather than investing on, you know, big speculative new towns, or I don't know, like coming from where cities, you invest in making your existing neighborhoods, you know, lively and working for its residents.
I think there's something really important about that scale, because you still hold a lot of the social relations on that scale of the neighborhood, that you really feel like it's yours and you know people. If it goes too big, then you lose that connection as well. So I think that neighborhood scale is really quite important, at least for us. If you start thinking about ideas of the commons, etc., I think that's really quite an important scale.
Federico De Matteis, do you want to share with us some reflection?
Thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. It's always very enlightening to see how much architecture is a lot about the process, not so much about the beautiful form. And you've shown this this counterpoint very well, and also in terms of how the civic dimension, as we were discussing before, becomes so important in order to create bonds that go beyond the, let's say, the pure appearance. There is one question which someone also is elaborating on a hint that was coming from the chat. Have you ever encountered a form of bias against temporary architecture? Not in terms of, let's say, the interventions, but in terms of the concept of temporary as such. And I explain why I'm asking this question, because it's something that is very much related to L'Aquila, which is a city which has had its own, let's say, event, which was not the Olympic Games, but was this earthquake, which was devastating. And for a long time, and partially still today, the earthquake is happened 12 years ago, so it's quite a long time frame. But temporary has been perceived as something that was somehow keeping the population anchored to the dimension of emergency. And this was contrasted a lot, and today it's almost unacceptable to have a temporary anything in L'Aquila. So this is why I'm asking, because it's a specific fund that we're having. We've also discussed it with Giuseppe several times as he was organizing this temporary event that is to be held in the summer. So I wanted to ask about your experience, if you had any feedback of this type in your work.
I can fully understand it, because it has the aesthetic of the provisional and maybe not developed. And I've come across it in two instances where a group of refugee women wanted to use our space and then decided not to use it because it felt too fragile, too temporary in its own right. And the other one was where we set up in the Olympic Park, and there were a lot of new buildings next to it with a big shopping center. And some of the people that moved in were immigrants who worked very hard to get away from a kind of informal world to occupy this very formal world. And they got reminded of something they left behind. So those two moments I've encountered it. A bias against it is also, I think, growing, in terms, that's a different angle, in the increasing commercialization of it, of these temporary shopping centers, where it's quite aggressive, market-driven temporary use, which is expensive, which is a form of gentrification in some ways, which I think is not maybe important in your context, but it's a very kind of quick way to import a certain demographic into a neighborhood. And that's where I think most of the resistance I've encountered against temporary use is there. Brixton is a good example. The forgot what it's called, Pop Brixton. It's already in the word, like this idea of a pop-up commercial force that imports a lot of affluent middle class to display. So that's the kind of resistance you find against temporary use here. But I think it's a little bit different to I guess the conversation you are having.
Yeah, this is more like a big city dynamics. It's something that we see in major cities in Italy. Obviously, it's in London, not in smaller towns such as L'Aquila. But yeah, of course, I mean the nature of the cause of what it brings to temporary architecture can actually be very diverse and come from civic engagement, but also from let's say sneaking attempts at gentrification and other, let's say, commercial exploitations of urban space.
But I would say, if I understand you correctly, in Aquila, it's a language of crisis in a way, that provisional fixing, and and you have to distinguish yourself from that in order not to. I think that's a problem I haven't encountered, but I think it's a really important sensitivity, I guess, to consider.
Thank you.
I think that we have tackled the very different issues. So from the temporality, from the visibility, to performance and actions, and participation. It's a word that I don't like, but or like to create connection between different groups in the city. So I will like to thank Andreas for the presentation, and also Azzurra and Federico for their thoughts. And before concluding this conversation, I would like to remind to everyone the next step of the VUOTO talks that will be on May 6th in the afternoon, like today. The next guests will be James Binning from Assemble Studio with Rita Elvira Adamo and artist Ludovica Carbotta. Nothing. I would like just to thank everybody for listening, to thank Orizzontale for inviting me, and to thank MAXXI Aquila and the University of L'Aquila for organizing with Orizzontale this great initiative. Thanks again to everybody. And
Salvatore, there's a message for you in the WhatsApp. Check your WhatsApp. Maybe there's an important message before we leave. Maybe you won the lottery.
In case, share with friends.
Yeah, it's all.
That's great.
Okay, it was about the next. I think.
Oh yeah, sorry. I just thought maybe it was something very important.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.